All right. Hello. So I am here today with S.A. Grant because we had a conversation on Facebook, which was an interesting debate on the different types of podcasts and level of preparation necessary. And I was like, let's take this to the internet. You should come on my podcast. And then we sat down for the recording. He's like, so we're doing this live? And I was like, well, we probably should. So here we are. So in case you're like, where'd this live come from? That's it. This is a recording session, doing it straight to the internet. And we're going to be talking about different forms of podcasts and different ways it can be done and how really in their place they can all be very successful. So for those of you who don't know me, if you're watching it shared on SA's feed, I'm Michael Whitehouse. I'm the guy who knows a guy. I run a few different podcasts that you can find all at guywhoknowsaguy.com. But I suspect many people watching are on my feeds. So SA, tell them about yourself and who you are in case they don't know you.
Yeah, so I'm S.A. Grant. I'm the host of Boston Cage Podcast. I always go by many different titles, but I've kind of streamlined it down to a brand and growth strategist. So that's who I am, and that's what I've been doing for like the past, 20-something years. And I became a podcaster probably early 2020, and since then, I never looked backwards, and I love it. So we're going to definitely dive into that topic today.
Fantastic. So would you like to kick us off by kind of summarizing what we talked about and what the initial impetus for this was?
Yeah, so originally I had made a blog post on Facebook, and I was talking about like pretty much it kind of annoys me when I see someone that has a interview, but you can tell that they didn't do their due diligence. Like they're interviewing someone, but they're not really giving that person the best foot forward. So I was just saying that, ideally, if you're going to do an interview style podcast, there should be some like background research and some due diligence in there. So that way you can kind of talk about things that that person may not have spoken about on other shows before.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then you came in and you was like, well, I don't agree with that because again, your format is completely different. I mean, you have more of like a panel style podcast. So that's when we started talking about, well, let's talk about the different types of podcasting and what's the prep work that goes into each one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a few. So I have a couple for those who don't know. I've got the Power Lunch live show, which looks kind of like this one in format because I use grabbing something quick, just use the Power Lunch live show format. In case people are confused why they're watching the Power Lunch live show on Tuesday, that's what's going on. But so that one I have 4 guests, and it's fairly open who I invite to it. Basically, anyone who thinks they're interesting enough to be in the conversation, they can apply. And as long as they appear to be fairly literate, I'll often bring them on. And the concept of that show is open, dynamic conversations. We never know who's coming in. We never know what kind of flow we're going to have. And that's part of the appeal of the show. So I don't do the research because I don't need to. Part of it is I'm discovering with the audience who they are. But even on my other shows, I will admit I don't do a lot of pre-research for when talking to my guests, even the one-on-one shows. But part of that's I've spoken to so many people and I have so much broad knowledge that I'll give them some opening questions and kind of I let the guest take me on their journey. So I'm there to platform them, and so I'm going into letting them go where they want to go, which again I think shows that same objective of I don't want necessarily my interview with them to be the same one they do on every other show. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, if you go to their website, if they've got good branding and you've researched them well, you're going to ask similar questions what the other guy asked because that website and that branding should tell you what kind of things they should be talking about. And I like to kind of create that space of exploration. And it's just a matter of return on investment on time. So a lot of times I can learn a lot from them through the conversation and make that connection. But so I know some of the issue is definitely there's some hosts maybe don't have the experience and aren't as dynamic. And so they'll start asking the wrong questions and the guest has to rein them in and be like, whoa, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm over here now. So I can certainly see where that is. But that's my thoughts on being dynamic there.
Yeah, I think, for me, it's a little bit different, right? I mean, I look at it more so kind of like the talk show model. Like if Oprah Winfrey is going to sit down with someone and they're going to be talking about the book, she's going to buy the book, she's going to read some chapters of the book, because again, she's going to like dive into that person's psyche to
Yeah.
get them to be more emotional or to be able to tell you something that, again, like you said, if I read all the stuff on the website, then I kind of know what questions I shouldn't ask because that content is already in existence. So I'm going to do a little
Mm.
bit deeper dive, and I'm going to go into like their YouTube channel, and I'm going to find a video from 10 years ago. I'm going to go into
Mm.
their Facebook channel, and I'm going to find a picture with them and their family on vacation in Italy from 2015, and I'm going to change my question structure to talk about that. Like when I'm asking them about being a family man, I may say something like, okay, like out of all the countries you've been to, and I know you've been to Italy before, like, was that your best place of going to? Was that the place that you think you got the best return on? And they know in that moment that I've done my research. And it gives me
Mm.
opportunity in the first 5 minutes like kind of make that a concrete situation, because you and I both know when you're interviewing someone in the first 5 to 10 minutes, they'll run off. They just want to tell you everything and do their pitch really quick without
Yep.
actually really telling their story.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And one of the things I've done with all my shows, try to have like a key first question or first couple of questions that focus it in. So with my Neurodiversity Superpowers podcast, the point of that show is to share the strengths and superpowers of neurodiversity. So,
Mm,
your ADHD, how does that make you successful? Your dyslexia, your whatever, and really focus on there. And so my opening questions are always, how are you successful, which is often in their bio, so I often skip that question. And then what's the form of your neurodiversity? And then how has your neurodiversity led to your success? And so that drives it to the focus, because the question of the show in general is, how does neurodiversity lead to success? So the opening question can be, how does your neurodiversity lead to your success? And in the case of that show, often most of my guests haven't talked about this in any of their content, unless maybe it's deep into their Facebook page. Except a couple who have been, neurodiversity advocates. Most of them, they're marketing people, they're salespeople, they're coaches, whatever. So that one's interesting because I'm exploring a topic that some of the guests, they come on the show and they say, I never thought about this until you sent me your
mhm,
questions. Which is a whole different kind of show than, say, my Guy Who Knows the Guy podcast, which is more about interviewing around business and how has networking helped you in your business, and share networking strategies and that kind of thing.
mm.
But so there's, it's the nature of the show,
Yeah.
brings us to a different place.
So let's talk about that. I mean, obviously, like mine is a more one-on-one, more personal kind of quaint interview style, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yours is more like one of yours is more like a panel, right? You talk
Mm-hmm.
about having multiple different guests, and you're pretty much orchestrating the noise, letting those guests kind of answer questions and talk amongst themselves, and you're heading them down the right path. But like we haven't talked about like a solo podcast, like
Yep.
what would that look like? Someone that's just talking into the camera by themselves. I would think they'll have to do a lot of due diligence on that particular topic to make sure that they come across knowledgeable and also very animated, because again, a talking bobblehead by themselves could be completely boring at times.
Yeah. Well, and as I said, Neurodiversity Superpowers is a solo. I mean, me and them,
Mm,
is a two-person show. So I often know I have some background on the guests, but I have often not done a really deep dive into them, because I'm discovering the story, and I think done well, and I like to think I do it well. People give me positive feedback when they listen. But I think done well, then there's that sense of I'm discovering with the audience.
mm,
And so as I'm finding something out, the audience is finding it out, and we're exploring together. And hopefully I'm asking the kind of questions the audience is like, well, but what about this? And I
mm,
then ask, what about this? And they're like, oh, that would have been my question.
mm,
Which the upside of planning ahead is that you can really kind of think about, okay, what would the audience want to know? What's
mm,
their ideal question? But for me, if I was to pre-plan it, if I don't have that naturalness, that's not spontaneity, that's what I'm trying to say.
mm,
If I don't have that spontaneity, then I'd be kind of asking more formulaic questions and less like, oh, that brings me to my next, your answer brings me to this next question.
mm.
So so I can certainly see how preparation, especially with the Oprah example, something like that, that it's a matter of providing you're really trying to create an experience of revelation of this person and their story, um, and provide that value for the audience. And yeah, I think it also gets down to, there's different types of podcasts, in that there's the ones that are more produced, more Oprah style. And beyond that, going into shows like, How I Built This or Masters of Scale, or, those kinds of shows that are really produced like radio shows. But then at the other end, I find there's can be a lot of shows which is more kind of like two people bumping into each other at a bar and be like, oh, you want to grab a seat? Yeah, sure. Let's grab a beer. And it has more that organic sense of people getting to know each other, and you're just sitting at the end of the table listening in on that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if they're interested, and again, it depends on the host. There's some hosts that should not do that show because they can't carry that energy. But for others, if effectively, if somebody would want to listen to your conversation at a bar, then that's good. Whereas if you don't have that dynamic energy, it's not going to work well for you.
So let me play devil's advocate, right? So this comes down to the timing of the podcast, right? So then this kind of goes into like the debate. Should it be a 5 minute? Should it be a 20 minute? Should it be 40 minutes? Should it be 1 hour? And I think that time factor is a variable to what you're talking about. Because I mean, if you're having a podcast and you're exploring that person for the first time, I would think the only way you can really deeply explore that person is going to have to be a longer format.
Of course, yeah, definitely.
At least 45 minutes to an hour to kind of really get those roots of who that person is, versus like if someone did some due diligence, they could probably cut down on that time. And keep in mind, like my episodes are about an hour, but I compact it with so much information because I get right to the points based upon the research. And again, I'm going against what they have already answered in the questions they've already been asked before. So I'm compacting it with so much content and value. That way the podcast becomes more of their marketing tool, and also marketing tool for me as well, because they're going to use my episode versus using everyone else's.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and yeah, it depends what the purpose of the podcast is for. So I assume you repurpose your content and cut clips out of the podcast and share them out and all those sorts of things. Yeah. So like I don't have the team to do that at this point. So while I have all this content, and it would be good to repurpose it, that's not currently a core part of the strategy because I don't have the infrastructure at this point. I'm thinking of also like Tom Poland's podcast, where he has 7 standard questions, and I think it's 7 questions in 10 minutes. And it is 10 minutes, like at 10:01, the podcast is over. He's already hit stop. So if you ramble on, you don't get 7 questions. But his is interesting because he uses it as a way to meet people. So if somebody wants to connect with them, he says, yeah, come on my podcast. I'm going to ask you these 7 questions. You get the 7 questions ahead of time. You can prepare. But he doesn't need to do research because he's going to ask those same 7 questions no matter what. And it's the introduction is 10 minutes. So the listener's like, okay, I'm only investing 10 minutes in this. Let's see who Tom's talking to. So it's more formulaic and less, less personal, but it's also a way to be like, oh, I've heard about this guy. Oh, in 10 minutes, I can get Tom 7 questions, and boom, 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 boom. So in that case, it's putting the research, using the show as the research, which is the far end of the spectrum from the Oprah model, where the interview is the product. This is more a matter of the primary value is the connection being made. And then on top of that, this connection is being shared to an audience who might want to also ride along on that connection. And that's somewhat how I use the Guy Knows a Guy podcast a lot, is people I want to get to know better or get to know. I'll have them on the show and get to know them through the conversation, and then share that conversation with my audience. And then they can also get to know them. So it's kind of like they can ride along on a 1-to-1 and then listen to it and be like, oh, I really liked what you said on there. I'd like to have you on, I'd like to meet you also. But, so it's the podcast itself becomes the research tool instead of researching for the podcast.
So let's talk about scalability with that. I mean, and it's another format that's kind of new to the market sector. And I'm trying to pronounce the word. It's asynchronistic podcasting.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So let's think about that. I mean, what you're describing is, say, 7 core questions, right? And in that style of formatting, you're going to pre-record. I'm not saying that's what you do, but you can pre-record these questions, and then you can go to scale. You can kind of send out a landing page and have people opt in and record their responses at scale, on a global scale. So that way you don't even have to be part of that equation. You pre-record the information, and then whoever you're interviewing goes to this page, reviews their content, reviews your questions, answers it via video or audio, and then you have a podcast. So my question is like, if that's like the going style, right? That the 7 questions, then why are more people not doing it that way or doing it at scale?
Well, so the challenge of scaling is you're no longer meeting the person.
Mhm.
So one of the things that Tom gets out of doing his podcast the way he does is he gets to meet someone, and it's a 10-minute meeting. It's quick, it's easy. But also once you hit stop, you're still on the call.
Mhm.
So he can, now that they've answered some questions and they're kind of warmed up, now they can have a conversation. They can see how they can help each other. They can pivot into that. And so doing that at scale with the pre-recorded questions, it depends on what you're doing it for. So if you're trying to create content, I can see that being a great scale way to produce content.
Yeah.
I'm almost thinking like Evan Carmichael, where he does the 10 best tips from Zig Ziglar and from Elon Musk and whatever. That's of course existing content is repurposing.
Mhm.
But I can totally see someone doing that where they come up with 7 or 12 standard questions, especially for someone who's super busy, who's like, I don't have time for an interview. Well, do you have like 9 minutes to record some videos on Video Ask? They'd be like, okay, yeah, I can do that. That would actually be a really interesting platform for getting some like heavy hitters on a show and sharing that. It wouldn't develop the relationship because of course you wouldn't actually talk to them to do it. You just get videos back from them.
Yeah.
But so it's a question of what is the podcast for content? Is it for audience building? Is it for networking that as a secondary tool produces content? What are you there to do?
Well, I would say, I mean, looking at it from like a growth strategy standpoint, I could look at it as monetizing it, right? Let's say, prime example, both of us have podcasts, and our main podcast is the one that we do the interviews on. That's the one that we're being ranked, and we have like the brand to support that particular podcast. What would it look like to then start a secondary podcast that's asynchronistic? That way someone can kind of pay to play on that platform. Because again, we have to be scheduled to be on our podcast, and then we have a limitation to it. Like my podcast right now, it's monetized based upon supply and demand. Like we are at season 4 and episode 140, but we've recorded over 400 episodes, and there's no way possible for us to release all those episodes at one time. So if you record an episode today, that episode's not going to release for a year. But what would it look like to say, hey, pay X amount of dollars into a more streamlined asynchronistic platform to come on? I have the set questions. You answer those questions. The podcast comes out pretty much within days after it's done as they're recorded.
That's a really interesting concept.
Yeah.
And it's really focused because my focus, I'm a networking guy. Networking is what I do, partly because it doesn't take systems to talk to people. So devising the systems, I'm like, okay, now I got to create a system. Whereas that's a much more system-heavy version of the content creation versus the.
But it feeds into it, though, right?
Yeah, but it scales really nicely.
Yeah.
And it also means that for a networker, with this really simple, and you use something like Video Ask or one of those systems where they just go through, ask a question, you hit record, you give your answer. When you could make a whole bunch of, for every person you have a 10-minute podcast. And so when you go to make the introduction, be like, oh, you should meet an essay. Here's the 7 questions I did with them. And so before setting the call, they can listen to a 9, 10, 11-minute interview and hear your voice and hear, a bit of your background and whatever. And I could see that being both an audience generation tool and a monetization tool, if you have some way to propagate that out. And that's a really good idea.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I like as we're talking, I'm just kind of like systematically done, and it could be a feeder too, right?
Yeah.
Like prime example, like with my podcast, we're interviewing like multimillionaires and billionaires and people that are potentially successful in doing whatever they're doing, and they're using our platform for marketing. But what would it look like to have an opportunity to interview someone that's in corporate America that's getting ready to start their entrepreneurial journey, but they still work for someone? That's like the prerequisite for my show. Why would I not make a show that does that, but do it, where they can kind of self-run it, and then as I'm watching the content and I'm pulling back into it, then I can follow back up with them with email campaigns and say, okay, a year ago you filmed this, and where are you now? It kind of gives you, like you're saying, the more soft touch to follow back up. And a year later, they could be highly successful. They could be a multimillionaire in a year, and
Yep.
then bring them on the show and do the one-on-one like we're doing right now.
Yeah. And you email them a year later. I don't know if you remember, you did the show a year ago. Because the number of podcasts they could send me a link to my own episode from the past and be like, I don't know if you remember this interview, but we did this. And I'd be like, did we?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I've done
Yeah.
60 interviews.
But when you get them, you always kind of look at it and be like, oh, and then the memory comes back really quickly once you see stuff on camera. So
you're like, oh, this one was great. Yeah, this is awesome. Yeah, there would be some post-production for doing the video esque model, because you'd end up with 7, but it would just be concatenated videos. So
yeah, you could playlists.
You could do that. You can do that production on Canva.
Yeah.
When I discovered Canva did video production, I'm like, wait a minute, what? You can just drop video and it just does it.
It's crazy.
For the easy level stuff, because I've had some of these where, like when I was using Zencaster, produced 2 separate video feeds. And so now, now I got to go into the video editing software and set them up and make sure they're the right size. And then I got to output it, and it's 30 minutes long. So it's going to take 19 minutes for it to render the files. And there's some technology now. Canva's one. I think there's some others too that are much. And for years, I've been like, why can't I just I just want to concatenate 3 files together. Why can't I just be like plunk, plunk, plunk and have it do it? And I think Canva's finally providing that, like the level of simple video editing that you want for that. So yeah, that would actually be a really easy
setup.
Because of course your questions would be pre-recorded and they'd be the same every time.
Same
everything. Or actually you might not even have the host questions, because sometimes you'll I've seen like YouTube videos or whatnot where it like puts the question up as text.
Yeah.
You probably want to read it though, because if someone's not watching the screen. Yeah. I've seen some where it's just text, but then they took that and put it onto an audio podcast. Gary Vee did that once. He repurposed a YouTube video with text questions into his audio podcast. So you couldn't actually hear the questions. It was just silence and then he'd answer.
I would think probably a database, if you could have like maybe 30 questions and have it automatically pick 10 questions. So that way all the questions will be kind of scrambled every single time you're interviewing someone. Like that changes everything. So that all that content really becomes kind of like a unique content out of those. You keep adding more questions to the pool probably as well.
Yeah, that's the other possibility is the guests could select their questions. Like you have these 3 standard questions and then choose 4 of these 12.
Yep.
So they can pick which questions they want to answer.
Yeah, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, obviously, if you're asking a question like, hey, are you an author? Have you written a book? And if they've never done that, then they can just skip past that question.
Tell me about your book. I didn't write a book. What experience do you have publishing a book? I didn't write a book.
Yeah. So it could be completely irrelevant, right? It kind of be something that they can kind of select. But I mean, to your point, I think we kind of got off topic onto another topic that's a very fascinating topic. But I mean, I don't think that this style of podcasting is in the market sector as of yet. At least I haven't seen it as of yet.
Yep. Look, we got a comment. And so interesting purpose of repurposed content, visual and auditory, can also be transcribed. And then I like the question list idea. Thanks, Scott.
Cool.
So
let's talk about obviously we talked about solo podcasts, like the mono, like the one person by themselves. We talked about the one-on-one interviews. We talked about like the panel cast that you have. We haven't talked about like co-hosts, like 2 hosts potentially working with each other or potentially interviewing someone else or interviewing other people.
Which I don't have experience with. But so actually my most popular, most successful podcast is a solo. It's Morning Motivation. It's a daily under 5-minute motivational podcast. And that one gets, I think it's like 20,000 downloads a month.
Nice.
Probably because it's daily. So the same number of subscribers for a daily podcast gets a lot more downloads than for a weekly or monthly podcast. It's just 31 times 100 is more than 4 times 100. But I mean, each episode's getting 60 to 100 downloads. So
gotcha. So at scale, and that they're small too. So I mean, you have that working in your favor as well. Yeah,
and I think that's what it is. It's interview podcasts are unpredictable. I'll go to listen to an interview podcast, and most of them, like, oh, I love this host, but the host is speaking for 8% of the time, and the guest is speaking 92% of the time. And some hosts make a really great, a great vibe and energy, which actually I think will tie back into your the panel, the co-hosts. But then other hosts, like there's one person who is really interested in learning more about what she does, but she doesn't talk about herself at all in her show. So I'm like, I don't want to hear about your guests. I want to hear about you. Whereas like Morning Motivation, if you like one episode, you'll probably like the next 10 because they're basically the same. I mean, different topics, whatever, but they're basically the same thing, somewhat reliably. Whereas a lot of interview shows are going to end up being different depending on the guest. But we talk about co-hosts. I'm thinking of there's a show, Bad Girls on Business, which is 3 hosts. So it's often 3 hosts and 1 guest. So the dynamic of the hosts really permeates the show. So if you like the dynamic of the hosts, whoever the guest is just kind of adds into that vibe, as opposed to the guest controlling the vibe of the show.
So it's an interesting format. I mean, they kind of outweigh the guests. I mean, you could have like a 3-way conversation and the guests could just be sitting there just waiting for their turn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but they are good about like focusing on the guest. So one will ask a question, someone says something, maybe someone comments, and then someone asks a question back to the guest. So the guest is still speaking more than half the time on the show. So yeah, I can definitely see how it could be done very wrong with a co-host show where the guest is kind of like, so what am I doing here?
That's crazy. So I'm trying to think, what other formats did we not talk about so far? The nonfiction or the storytelling podcasts.
Okay. Yep.
Like the murder mystery podcast, or I think that kids listen to a lot of these. Like my kids, like literally, my daughter, she'll wake up and play this random murder mystery with some. It's a single person. It's a mono podcast, but she's telling a story about someone that got killed and trying to figure out who the killer was. And so, I think with those podcasts, it's an interesting format. Of like I think they'll have to do research. I mean, they have to have some kind of storyline. They just can't just talk off the top of their head and maybe somebody can just make a story up like that. But
well, Hardcore History, which is one of the like biggest podcasts, I think it's one of the top 50 in the world. His average episode is 4 hours long, and it's all so. And I know he does research ahead of time, but I don't think he scripts them. I think he outlines them. But he's got enough experience that it sounds it's a mix between scripted and improv. But it's just him talking for 3 or 4 hours about Genghis Khan or Darius or whatever. But it is interesting because he's telling a story. And that one's more improvisational. I also listened to Tides of History with Patrick Wyman, and I believe he writes his episodes and then basically reads them. But he's telling a story of something history wise, and they're really real. It's almost like an audiobook with the way he does. In fact, he put out an audiobook, and it was a lot like his podcast. I liked his podcast, so I liked his audiobook. But it's almost like an audiobook in short form, 45 minutes. Dan Carlin, Hardcore History, is just like an audiobook in long form. I've listened to audiobooks shorter than individual episodes, and the two things currently on the Hardcore History feed, I believe, are 4 episodes and 6 episodes. So 18, 20 hours long. But one of them, the most recent one is Japan from the 1850s through the end of World War II. So it's a fairly substantial story that he's diving into and going into. But I often find those podcasts I listen to most because I can kind of latch onto the story and ride along. Whereas an interview, I can't necessarily sort of like lose myself in that, because like, where are you going with this, and who is this, and do I want to listen to this? Do I care who this person is? I don't know. Whereas, do I care about World War II? Yeah, that's an interesting topic. Sure, I'll listen to a bunch of hours about World War II. And it's predictable. I think that's like I'm an overworked entrepreneur with ADHD, so knowing what I'm going to get when I hit play is for the next 12 hours we're talking about the Persian Empire. All right, I'm ready to listen to tell me about the Persian Empire for the next 12 hours.
So it sounds like radio. I mean that's when it gets into like old school 40s radio and before TV and people were like sitting there watching a speaker and using their imagination to fill in the blanks. And I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
podcasts comes from that, but it's been branched out so many different folds that it's not necessarily radio anymore. So the fact that you're bringing that up and you're saying that you're still like that format and it's 4 hours long, it makes me think about, okay, like earlier you were saying that your downloads, right? You have this 5-minute podcast and you're getting such a high quantity of downloads. What's his downloads like? I mean, is he doing that many downloads as well, or and if he is, are people listening to the full 4 hours, or they just listening to like the first few minutes of it?
Oh yeah, no, Dan Carlin's getting thousands and thousands of downloads with Hardcore History. I don't know about the other ones, but yeah, those are, and yeah, his podcast is just him talking basically. The Wondery Network, that's where Tides of History is, and a few others. That's more produced shows, often a lot of single narrator stories, sometimes history, but it's the same kind of stuff that is, they make documentaries out of on Netflix, just in audio form.
Yeah.
And telling those stories. But I've also heard more radio plays. There's one I listened to called Alice Isn't Dead, which is I believe it's a single actor or a single actress, but it's made to sound like the entire show is listening to her CB. And like she's trying to find her wife who disappeared, and she's like speaking out onto the CB, and that's what you're hearing. Mm-hmm. So that's how they do time jumps, because it's basically like Vox recording. So when you stop recording, time goes by, the tape stops recording. So a day might go by, because that's the conceit of the show. But yeah, there's a lot of radio plays out there that are like old school, The Shadow Knows kind of radio plays. Some are single voice, some are many, half a dozen actors, sound effects, the whole thing. And I think some is the value of, some might just be people are busy. So you listen to a radio play, you can do that while you're mowing the lawn. You can do it while you're walking the dog. You can do it while you're exercising in a way that you can't so much with television.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you're describing, I would put it under the category of theater podcasts. And to your point, it's multiple different people, sound effects, and the bells and whistles. Because again, you're trying to paint this picture visually through audio. Got it. So then I think another one that we missed was I think we talked about it off air, was Repurposing Podcast, and I think you mentioned it a little bit with the video that you're talking about, the Gary Vee video. It's like repurposing something like this. Just talk about that. I mean, obviously, this is just another format of podcasting, but do you see credibility in reformatting other content into podcasts?
I definitely will. So I think it depends on who's doing it. Like Gary Vee, people want to get Gary Vee content. And so it's like, I want some Gary Vee, but I'm driving the car. I can't watch YouTube. So I'll listen to the podcast. Or I'm on TikTok right now, but I want Gary Vee. Or Gary Vee wants to reach you. So like he really does repurposing at scale, that wherever you are, YouTube, TikTok, LinkedIn, podcast, paper books, whatever, you can get some Gary Vee in any one of those formats. And he repurposes everything from keynote speeches to podcast interviews to whatever. But I think the other thing is, it's a matter of if the content creator is the limiting factor. So people often say, Michael, you should repurpose your content. As if I'm doing it myself, I might as well record new content, because it is easier and more fun for me to hit record again and do more content than to sit down and do video editing and like cut it out and put the audio here and find this there and take a 40-minute show and put it into a 3-minute format. And like, that's not fun for me. But if I get to the point where, or as I get to the point where I'm busier and I'm hiring people to do this, my team can't create more content for me because they're not me. So for Gary Vee, he's only got so much time to record content. So he records some, and then he's got a team who just goes through all these hours of video and clips out this and carves out that. So that's where, if you're a solo coach, I wouldn't say you should be repurposing your content if you like creating content. Now, if you hate it, if you're like, oh my God, I've got to record something, then yes, record the 20 minutes you need to, and then sit in a cave and edit and repurpose. But if you like creating content, it's the same thing as outsourcing. You know, you want to do the things that have the highest return and lowest cost, and outsource the things that have the lowest return and the highest cost to do yourself. So if you are that big, and you know, the greatest example is something like Zig Ziglar. It is very hard to make new Zig Ziglar content.
100% correct.
Yeah, if you see new Zig Ziglar content, be very suspicious. But they can take, there's hundreds of hours probably of talks he's done, videos, books, recordings, whatever, that they can then take and repurpose and reshuffle and do all these different things with to keep him relevant. Because if you had a podcast, you'd be like, oh, I wonder what's 119 episodes back. Unless it's a history of Rome, where I'm going to listen to this like a giant audiobook. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to go back to, you know, I doubt anyone's going to either of our podcast feeds and being like, oh, I wonder what was 100 episodes ago. If you want someone to listen to it, you better reissue it as episode 200. Otherwise,
well, there are some weird people out there that I've gotten those messages before. Like they found the podcast and they automatically go back to episode 1, and it's kind of like,
well, okay, there's that. Yeah.
It was like, okay, well, that's interesting, but. I think the other part of what you're saying is definitely interesting in the sense that if we're looking at podcasting as like a monetary thing, right? Or you're looking at it as far as lead magnets, it's interesting that you have 3 podcasts, right? Because again, for me, I thought about doing 2 at one time.
I have 5 actually.
You have 5. Okay, so like let's talk about that, right? Like
probably too many.
If let's say if you were just to have one, do you think you would have time to repurpose your content versus creating the 4 other podcasts that you're doing right now?
Well, so each one serves its own particular purpose. Mm-hmm. So the Neurodiversity Superpowers will probably be a limited run podcast because that was more of a passion project. I started to meet some people. I'm like, I want to tell this story. Mm-hmm. It doesn't tie into the larger business. But the most successful one is the easiest one to make. It's the morning motivation. I record it an hour a week and then hand it to my VA and she does everything else. Mm-hmm. So I spend less time on my most successful podcast that gets the most engagements by download standards. But the Guy Who Knows a Guy podcast, the podcast I made the most money from.
And that's the longer format.
Because it is where I've met clients and people have introduced me to clients.
So other one, like, is that other one used as a lead magnet? I mean, this is kind of going into like that's more like a news briefing, like a flash briefing podcast, right? It's 5 minutes, it's really quick. It's every day.
Yeah, and it's a motivational message. You know, a little kick in the butt to do something smart, basically. And I originally created it at the beginning, going into 2021, and I think it was originally called Crush 2021. It was from like Thanksgiving to New Year's, and I was selling access for like $9 or something, and nobody bought it. But I'm like, well, I'm recording it. I might as well just put it out as a podcast feed instead of behind a paywall that nobody's buying. And I went to stop it, and a bunch of people were like, whoa, I was listening to that. So I'm like, well, I guess I'll keep doing it because you seem to really like it. And it kept going, and the numbers kept going up, and it kept going, and it gets more and more people listening to it. The challenge I have found is figuring out what to do with it. So I haven't figured out how to convert people from listening to that to buying something else or going somewhere else or whatever else. I do have a sponsor, actually, someone who approached me about sponsoring my email list, and when I threw the podcast in the mix, the sponsorship increased. So it's generating some revenue that way. But that has been the challenge. Is I'm getting these listeners, but because it's not like I have thousands of listeners. Yeah, if I had 1,000 downloads per episode, then I just like, hey, brand, give me money. I've got 1,000 listeners. Go, pay me to reach them. But at 90, that's not necessarily a sponsor
quantity. It's the fact that you have 30 episodes.
Yeah,
gotcha.
So it's hard to track too, and part of that's just a matter of sitting down and tracking it. I don't necessarily use tracking links for things as I should, and because there's only one of me, so it's a matter of triaging, where I can put the energy for that. But the initial thought around it, for a show that doesn't necessarily convert, and is every day. It takes an hour a week to make. It's super fun because it's just as motivating to record it as it is to listen to it. Because I get in this high energy state of there's music playing in the background as I'm giving the message, and it's just a lot of fun. A lot of its purpose is to continue engaging with, branding, whatever term you want to use, an existing audience. So I'll meet someone, I'll say, oh, I've got daily motivational podcasts. They're like, oh, that sounds great, I could use that. And then they listen to it. And then I talk to them 3 months later, or I get an email from them being like, oh, I really love this episode. Or I really appreciate this. So it's a way to stay top of mind.
So with your sponsor on that one, are they running like ads on that one? I mean, like how does that work with them?
Yeah. So what we're gonna do? So the sponsor actually reached out about, or reached out through a network that we're in, about sponsoring the PS on my emails. So all my email list emails would be like, PS, our sponsor is this guy. And actually we've just signed it up. We don't have the content yet. But as I was like, so how much do you want? And I'm like, I don't know. Let's see. So as I was figuring that out, I was like, I've got this podcast. I could give him a post-roll ad. I don't want to give him pre-roll because pre-roll on a 4-minute ad, a 4-minute podcast can kind of break the flow. But I'm like, I can give you a post-roll spot as part of the deal. And so he's going to send me the post-roll ad, and then we're going to put it at the end there. And I figured it doesn't drop the flow because, if you really don't want to listen to it, you don't listen to it. Yeah. But if he makes an interesting enough post-roll ad, people are like, okay, I will spend 30 seconds listening to this guy, seeing what he's about. He works in the coaching space. He does things that are relevant to our audience. And speaking of interesting to our audience, Scott likes this idea. You're welcome, Scott. Good thing you're watching.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting. I mean, there's this. We get that question a lot as this podcasters is like, do you want to do ad spots or you don't want to do ad spots? And it's obviously the two schools of thought. I mean, your school of thought was taking something that's not monetized and monetizing it with something that's relative value. And the other point of view, it's kind of like mine. It was like, well, why would I give up that position when I can actually utilize that position for my services or for my products and self-promote in my own ad spots?
Yeah. Well, but also the difference is you have a properly functioning funnel. And I do not have a properly functioning funnel. I have some programs that when people are in them, they are very happy to be in them. And I have a lot of content that people enjoy getting. I do not have a system built out to funnel from one to the other.
Got it.
So it's more valuable to sell that spot to someone who can do something with it than to take that spot and be like, hey, go to my thing. I got some stuff going on.
Got it.
No.
Well, I think you got a 4:00 coming up. I think we're approaching on time.
Yes.
I think this was pretty fun. I think hopefully the listeners got some solid value just to kind of hear two podcasters kind of bounce ideas about general podcasting.
I got some value, so that's what matters to me. Is me. So hopefully you got some value too.
Spoken like a true podcaster.
Yeah. I often joke about that. Be like, what I care about is myself. I don't actually act that way, and I actually had someone today. I was going to make an introduction, and she asked me. She's like, "So do you have an arrangement with him that if something comes of it, you're going to get paid for it?" And I was like, "Oh no, I don't." And she's like, "Well, you might want to set that up before you introduce him to me." And I was like, "Oh yeah, maybe I should do that."
You get that little affiliate action going.
And I do often. Fortunately, I surround myself with good people, and people often be like, "So, Michael, don't forget your ask in the group." I run a networking group, and at the beginning, everyone has their asks, and often there's a segment where I will forget, and I'll go to move on, and a member will be like, "Didn't you forget something, Michael? Don't you need to ask for something?" Oh, right. Yes, I do. But I believe that there's no such thing as true altruism. Everyone does things for their reason. But good. Scott got some value too. But that reason may be that ego boost you get when you're like, "Oh, I've got the guy you need. Oh, let me make that introduction for you. I'm a guy who knows a guy." Guy who knows a guy was about ego long before it was about money. Because it gives me a rush to be the guy who knows a guy, to have that connection. Yeah. Now, no one's like, "What? You get a psychological benefit out of helping me? Well, heck with you." Everyone gets a benefit, whether it's financial or ego or social or health or something. Anyone who does anything gets some benefit for it.
Yeah, yeah. It's always. I mean, obviously, if it's a two-way street,
Yeah.
the equality makes everyone happy, right? So,
Yep. Yeah,
very
and it's especially important when we talk about like nonprofit activities.
cool.
When people are like, why do people donate? Well, because I watch a lot of nonprofits trip over this because they don't understand there is no altruism. Because you have to understand that if you want to compel people to give you money.
Yeah, yeah.
And
There's also the tax benefits, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that could be it too. But at the small scale, if you're getting $100 donation, they're probably not doing it for the taxes.
Yeah.
But so there's different ways you can get people to, to cough up the money if you understand what they get out of it. And it's easier in business where like, give me money and I will give you a course that will give you this result. Whereas a nonprofit's like, give us money and we'll feed this kid.
Yeah, or you get a brick with your name on it. I mean, either way, right?
Yep. But yeah, so this has been great. And I probably should get to my next meeting.
Let's do it again, man. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Yes, this has been. I'll have to have you on the Power Lunch live show sometime.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott, for watching, and anyone else who is watching on the replay or elsewhere. Let's see, we got a like from Elise, so thank you, Elise. And everyone else who is watching everywhere else on the internet. I love these. I should do more of these impromptu lives. This is pretty cool. So, all right, I'm gonna hit the red button. Thanks, everybody.